So in the previous lecture, we talked about the four components of the requirements engineering. And I said in future lectures, we'd go over each of these four and kind of describe what they are in depth. And in this lecture, we're going to talk about the first one, elicitation. So let's go ahead and just label our canvas, elicitation. Now, elicitation, the main goal of elicitation in requirements engineering is to define your domain. And pretty much it's just, what is this software? An example, it could just be like a student portal. It could be an e-store, an e-commerce store. It could be a software for farmers or any type of occupation you can think of. So that's defining our domain, which is the goal of our elicitation phase. Now there's several different ways you can accomplish elicitation. And what we're going to do, we're going to go over each of those different elicitation techniques is what we're going to call them. So we have our techniques. And these techniques are going to be background reading, which I'm going to abbreviate as BG, BG reading. So it's going to label that one, label that two. We'll have interviews. And we're going to go to a new canvas. Seems like I messed that up. I go to a new canvas, and 3 is going to be just simple surveys. 4 is going to be brainstorming. And I'm going to come back to each one of these and kind of describe in depth of what they entail. We're going to have meetings. 6 is task observation, which I'm just going to abbreviate to OBS. And then we're going to have finally our ethnography. Okay. Now we're going to go back to our first two techniques. So background reading is just, let's go ahead and switch to blue. Actually, let's go ahead and switch this color to a nice, let's go yellow. Actually, it's not. Let's go more of a purple. So our techniques, we're going to start with background reading. And that's just pretty much just reading different sources of information. So like company documents. And this could be like their annual report or stuff like that, or different organizational charts, technical papers, etc. And the advantages of background reading is understanding the organization and what it does before you go in. So you kind of have a grasp on what they might want to do. But the disadvantages is that the written documents aren't usually the best interpretation of reality. You can learn a lot about the company, but you really won't know what the company is about until you talk with like management or developers, etc. Then our next technique, our elicitation techniques, is interviews. And the interviews kind of requires the engineer or analyst to discuss the system with different stakeholders, and they build and understand the requirements through that. So it's like we'll have a requirements engineer sit down with a bunch of different people who represent the client, and they'll ask them questions about the system. And this can be structured or open-ended. So it can have pretty much what that means. It can have an agenda and preset questions, or it can just be free. You can ask any question. It's very open-ended. It's very more natural. And the advantage is that you get a lot of information from interviews. So you get a lot of information. I forgot to write down what this is, but I'll just put a lot of info. Ask questions is pretty much the summation of interviews. So you get a lot of info, and it's a very rich collection of information when you do interviews, But the problem is you get so much information, it's really hard to analyze this qualitative data. And it's hard to compare the different correspondents. So if you do multiple interviews, just by the nature of the questions or who's asking it and who's answering it, you might get different answers, very conflicting or contradictory answers, which obviously isn't desirable. Next, we'll talk about surveys, and I mean, I'm pretty sure we can all figure out what a survey is. It's just a few simple questions asked. And the good thing with surveys is that they're easy, they're simple, they're not very time consuming to put together and collect the data. But the problem with surveys is you can have a lot of biases. You can have a question bias, you can have a non-response bias, voluntary response bias, and you're kind of limited to the amount of the in-depthness of the answers because of the questions you ask. Because they have to be relatively simple questions for a survey. You can't always get the answers you want, and you can't ask follow-up questions on top of that. Brainstorming, this is just a natural collection of information between the group. So a natural collection of info within group. So this is kind of just brainstorming. It's just almost like a form of interview where you just come up with different ideas, but you don't allow debate or criticism. So you can't really challenge anything. It's just literally idea generation. And then meetings are used for summarization and feedback. So it's a very important managerial tool. So once we have our information, we can schedule a meeting to just validate information is pretty much what a meeting does. So you meet with your client and you go over, hey, just to make sure this is what you want, this is the requirements A, B, and C, and these are the only things you want to be verified, completed. Then we have task observation, which is pretty much just inside shadowing. So you're just observing what they do and how you can improve it and how you can make your system better based off the environment and how they deal with problems, etc. Then ethnography is just long-term task observation. So you just pretty much stay there for an extended period of time and observe what goes on. And you get a rich amount of information with ethnography, but the downfall is that it takes, a long time to accomplish. And now that we have all 7 of these elicitation techniques down, you kind of know a little bit about them. You should be able to decide which ones are best suited for your software engineered project. Interview is probably one of the most common ones used, so that's always going to be a good route. Background reading is also very good, but I mean, it definitely depends on what system you have and what system you're creating. So we talked about let me find my brush. We talked about the elicitation portion of our requirements engineering, and in the next lecture we'll talk about the analysis phase of requirements engineering.